Last January, I was hospitalized with a fractured spine and a couple of other injuries. No surgery was required, but I had to lie in one place for a month. Imagine. It was painful and unpleasant to breathe because my ribs were broken and my lungs were bruised. It was even more painful to move my legs, and every awkward movement caused wild pain in my spine. Painkillers saved me, but their composition. They said that it was analginum with Dymedrol, and the hell knows what else. And the addiction to this stuff was awful. My grandfather was lying next to me, so when they stopped injecting him with painkillers, he was writhing in pain. He was lying with a compound fracture of his left leg, and his head hurt. This grandfather was the only one who walked out of the room alive in my presence. Over the course of a month, 6 other people were put in my room, but they all died. One of them had multiple stab wounds when he got to the hospital, so his death was natural. But the men with hernias and fractures were dying of unknown causes. Naturally, no one told me the cause of death, which made me feel a little scared. My grandfather told me that at night someone was walking as if in heels, not with a clatter, but with a clatter, and that sometimes you could hear the rattle of a gurney. You can't imagine what I felt when the corpses were carried out of the ward in the morning. Then I learned from the technician that people had died here before me, too, like flies, and in general, the ward was not good. A week after I came to the hospital, I had the idea to give up painkillers so that later I would not become addicted. For the first 2 or 3 days, everything was fine. As long as I didn't move, the pains didn't bother me much. Then the pains began to torment me at night, so that I slept mostly during the day. That's when it all started. At night I heard footsteps. Quiet, slow and rustling. They were headed toward my room. I, holding my breath, looked at the door and felt a strong pain again. I was lying with my head toward the door, so I turned my head, which caused the pain. The footsteps were getting closer, and the closer they came, the more scared I was. But then the door opened, and the nurse on duty looked in to see if everyone was asleep. I was relieved. I used to sleep at night, so I didn't know that she was making night rounds. I calmed down and went back to bed. Then I heard footsteps and the rattling of a cart again. I thought that they had brought a sick person and fell asleep. In the morning, I found out that no one had been admitted that night. Well, I thought, I don't know what the duty girl could carry at night. Again the night, again the footsteps, again the on-duty woman. When the on-duty comes in, you should close your eyes and pretend to sleep, otherwise follow an immediate injection of sedatives, after which the head hurts. And then there was the clatter of a gurney. In our room at the time lay 3 people, and 1 bed was empty, so we could throw the sick. The gurney rumbled closer and closer, and then I was really frightened. Through the sound of the gurney, I could hear the clanking of heels. I would have run if I could have. The gurney rumbled, and the heels clattered. And then everything went quiet. Suddenly, the door opened, and a gurney rolled into the room. I closed my eyes and pretended to be asleep, but the gurney stopped between mine and the next bed. "You're awake." The voice was a whisper, but it sounded like it was made up of many voices and sounds, among them cries of terror and sobs. I know. What had touched my arm now touched my shoulder, and then my face. I pretended to the last to be asleep, and I guess it saved my life. The bed opposite creaked. My neighbor must have woken up. His voice came to us from afar. "What's going on here? Who's there?" His question was answered by an ominous chuckle that sent shivers down my spine. The gurney began to slowly roll back toward the door, and I felt the breath on my face disappear. My heart was racing, and my body was paralyzed with fear. Suddenly, there was a deafening scream from my neighbor. I opened my eyes and saw him struggling against an invisible onslaught. The bed was shaking and creaking, and he struggled helplessly to free himself. I tried to get up, but my legs refused to listen to me. An eerie wave of fear ran through my entire body. I closed my eyes and tried to concentrate, wanting to wake up from the nightmare. But when I opened my eyes again, The reality around me was the same room. I was trapped in this nightmare with no hope of escape. So I was a prisoner of this cursed hospital, where my neighbors were dying and dark forces were terrorizing me every night. I didn't know how long it would last, or if I would ever be able to get out of here. All I could do was pray that this terrible story would have an end. Several years ago, I had a chance to visit a sanatorium, which is located in the heart of Canada. The places are noble, the dawns are quiet, the people are friendly. The contingent of the sanatorium at first surprised and slightly frightened. Some grandmothers and grandfathers. Who is blind? Who is deaf? Who rides a wheelchair? But later I imbued with them with all my soul. Here you have a gulp of wisdom and the tradition of ancient times. As the saying goes, 2 in 1. We became good friends with one such grandmother, the Lady of the Dandelion, and she told me a very interesting story. It happened, girl, when I was about 16 years old. It was just after the war. We had a big family, a lot of children, but they were all small, and I was the oldest of them. My mother was working hard in a factory, but I had no news from my father, whether he was alive or dead. And this uncertainty really frightened us. So, to help my mother, I got a job as a nurse in a hospital. Of course, I did not get much money, but I was well fed, and if some sick person didn't finish something, I brought a little guest. It was all right. We could live. On my first shift, I saw a dying man. It was an old man without lineage, without tribe, lonely, no one wanted. He was dying hard, groaning and kicking on a gurney, and his breathing was hoarse, as if someone was strangling him. At that time, our hospital had a small room set aside for such dying people so that they would not be seen by the sick. So in this dark little corner, my grandfather was slowly dying. For me, it was a shock. None of the doctors gave him any help, did not approach, did not look, did not check. And I paced back and forth down the corridor with my mop, but my feet kept taking me to that terrible cubbyhole. I tried to ease the fate of the dying man, to give him water, to wipe his face, but he was already very bad, not moving, and I could hardly feel his breath. And at one such moment, when I looked into the nook again, I saw a strange picture. The grandfather was sitting on a gurney, drooping barefoot. His back was bowed, his eyes were down to the floor, and his breathing was clear and calm. Out of shock, I found nothing better to do than ask, "Grandfather, are you all right?" Without waiting for an answer, I rushed to the doctor with the happy news that Grandpa was alive. The doctor wagged his finger at his temple, but went to see Grandpa. Opening the door and seeing the old man lying on a gurney, we realized at once, it's all over, he's dead. Wrapping the old man in an old sheet, we, together with a young, healthy, cheerful nurse guy, took him to the morgue. The picture in the morgue appeared depressing. Bodies lay everywhere, on gurneys, on bunks, and even on the floor. After putting the gurney with the old man in the corner, I began to take off his sheet. I hesitated a little, and did not see how the orderly slipped out into the street. I only heard the door slam and close with a latch. I shuddered with that sharp sound, straightened up, but before I could take a step, the light went out. The orderly at the door cackled happily. "Well, girl, have fun with Grandpa while he's still warm. I'll give you 10 minutes. I screamed wildly, tearing through the darkness toward the door, stepping on bodies along the way. I thrashed against the door like a wild animal beating against a cage, breaking my nails to blood, screaming and raising my voice in fear. But my tormentor's callous heart knew no mercy. For a moment I thought I heard a strange sound behind me, as if someone was breathing there in the darkness, hard and hoarse and labored. My eyes were already accustomed to the twilight, and I looked around sharply and saw an old man sitting on a gurney, his bare feet dangling limply. I shouted wildly, and then slowly fell to the floor. I woke up on the street. An orderly was slapping my cheeks. When he saw that the life returned to me, smirked. Happy baptism of fire, girl. And I was lying on the wet ground, in a dirty, wet hospital gown. I was exhausted and dizzy, but I felt as good as I had ever felt in my life. I breathed in the clean night air and wanted only one thing: to live. Once, as a medical student, I worked part-time in the surgical department of a ward hospital. I had to work the night shift. It was not a very pleasant job because I had to examine patients and give anesthetic injections. If there was a serious problem, I had to call a surgeon from the floor below to be on duty. The ward had a nurse call system with a button at the bedside and a remote in the nurse's room that, when pressed, would sound an alarm, and an LED would light up to indicate the number of the room the patient was in. Usually we worked together, but that Saturday my partner, Helen, begged me to do it alone. I hesitated to let her go until morning. The wards were half empty. There were no critically ill patients. Some had gone home for the weekend. The rest were convalescents, so no problems were expected. True, someone from the trauma unit had recently been operated on and placed in the vacated room, but he was still under anesthesia and would probably not wake up until morning. As expected, the shift went smoothly. I gave tramadol injections, changed urine collection bags for urological patients, and only called patients in a couple of times for minor issues. After dark, I stuck a match in the remote control compartment and gently pressed it against the speaker cone to lower the volume. There was no volume control, so when the air raid siren was called, it screamed so loud that everyone in the hallway could hear it, and the siren would stop. I flipped through the newspaper, which had scandal and Sudoku, took a notebook out of my bag, and lay down on the couch, resting it on my stomach. Across from the couch was a window leading to a corridor outside the nurse's station. In my half-asleep state, I suddenly felt that someone was looking at me. I looked up to the window in the corridor and vaguely saw someone behind it. It was corrugated glass, so I couldn't see any details. The only thing I could make out was that he was dressed in black and wore a strange headdress that looked like a red hat with earlobes. His face seemed pale and oval in shape. He must have only seen me as a mass of light behind the glass, but I could feel his gaze and knew that he had been standing there watching me for some time. I jumped up from the couch. My laptop fell to the floor, and I tried desperately to grab it, but to no avail. I looked at the window again and realized that there was no one behind it. I picked up the laptop, which had fallen on the slipper next to the couch, and it was intact. I examined it and found no damage. The screen had the credits of some kind of movie on it. I put the laptop on the chair, put on my slippers, and went out into the hallway. Of course, no one was there. It was quiet, except for the occasional snoring of an elderly patient. Wondering who was watching me through the window, I went back to the nurse's room and lay back on the couch, unaware that I had fallen asleep in spite of the experience. I was awakened by Helen, who returned after dark and began to rub me. "What's wrong?" I asked, opening my eyes. "Traumatologists, you saw it, didn't you?" she asked in horror. I got up and went to the room where the trauma patient was lying. When I saw him, I realized there was no one here to help me. There was a pool of blood under his bed. He was wrapped in bandages, and his face was blue. But that wasn't what scared me. The guy had both legs and his right arm broken, and he could only move his left arm. Apparently, the anesthetic had run out early, and he started convulsing, accidentally pulled the catheter out of his collarbone, and bled until he ran out of blood. Worst of all, the entire wall around the nurse call button was stained with bloody fingerprints. It had clearly been pressed more than once, if not 10 times. I rushed to the nurse's station. On the console was a newspaper with a scandalous story. I opened it and saw the bright red LED, but heard nothing. The alarm was supposed to keep barking until I turned it off manually. Then I realized I had damaged the speaker with a blunt match. It had cost the life of a trauma patient. Then Helen and I spent half an hour tidying up the room. We mostly ended up scrubbing the walls and blood off the dead man's fingers. Accidents, loss of blood, deaths, all these things were happening. No one at the hospital wanted unnecessary trouble. A few days later, I found an article in the Accidents and Incidents section of the community website. The article said that there had been an accident last Friday in which a young motorcyclist died in the hospital from his injuries after being hit by a car that crossed a double solid line. There are also photos of the accident scene. He is lying in a puddle of oil, the front forks caught somewhere under the engine, and an open, bright red helmet lies nearby.